Okay, so the next section of what I want to do is make a few comparisons between two different films and sort of show the kind of root or relationship of certain cinematic, thinking that you can find in one film and then watch the legacy or see the sort of tradition of it moving forward. The first thing I'm going to show is a section from the Bob Dylan documentary called Don't Look Back, which was directed by D.A. Pennebaker. It's from 1967 again. And this is a film that was a documentary following Bob Dylan's successful tour of England. It was made as a kind of verite documentary starring Bob Dylan and everybody who was around him. It's structured as a kind of story. I assume you probably know that D.A. Pennebaker is one of the pioneers of so-called verite documentary cinema in the 1960s, and has Frederick Wiseman is another pioneer of this kind of verite documentary filmmaking. Depending on the filmmaker, Pennebaker's work wasn't always politically engaged. Wiseman, for instance, tended to do very, very politically engaged film. Wiseman is extremely famous for a film called Titicut Follies, which was an expose of a mental hospital in America, the Titicut mental hospital, and it shed light on the kind of abuses in this mental hospital, and was again an instrumental film in terms of changing social policy. Another reference point of this kind of filmmaking would be the Maysles brothers. The Maysles brothers are probably most famous for the movie Grey Gardens, which is, I assume you're aware of it, it's in popular culture now. There's a lesser-known film of theirs called Salesman, which is a black and white film set in Texas that follows Bible salesmen traveling through the South. It's an incredible, remarkable film that uses the tools of narrative storytelling within a documentary to get at a kind of portrait film. So I'm going to show a little section of Don't Look Back that just captures the Dylan in his prime. Side-by-side comparison of it on a film. I think it goes without saying we're capturing Bob Dylan at the sort of peak of his career in the mid-60s and seeing him as a kind of provocateur, a kind of, anarchist of pop culture. This is an excerpt from the film I'm Not There by Tom Hanks.
Who was the interviewer?
The interviewer is a Time magazine journalist whose name I don't actually know, unfortunately. I'm sure it's accessible somewhere in the world of who that man was. Oh shit, I mean open, close, every hidden menu. Sorry. It's, I think, a remarkable film. Again, I think it's interesting to look at these films in terms of that really is a verite documentary. It's shot in a single long take because Bob Dylan only said those things one time. So the camera actually had to capture everything in a single take. And it's interesting to compare the grammar of that with something like I Am Cuba, which is a narrative film imitating the grammar of that style. For those of you who don't know, I'm Not There is a dramatic narrative film directed by Todd Haynes. It was released in 2007, and it was a kind of imaginary, fictional portrait of Bob Dylan in which Bob Dylan was played by a number of characters, including Cate Blanchett. And I'm going to show you a section of the films. Bob Dylan played by Cate Blanchett.
She looks like it more than this. Yeah. More than he does. This is I'm Not There in Japanese, it's called I'm Not There.
Would you say then that the collective struggles have changed because I believe, you referred earlier, he thinks the process itself is important.
So obviously, the reference point being a sort of direct reinterpretation of Don't Look Back and using the underlying source material of Bob Dylan in that moment of time. There's dialogue actually replicated from both of the sources. But it's also sort of exploded. I mean, I'm not there. I think it's a very ambitious, very intriguing film that really tries to get at the kind of idea of layered identity and the fugitiveness of the nature of Bob Dylan's work. It's a kind of speculative essay, really, in some ways, rather than a kind of traditional coherent narrative film that tries to unearth in a kind of architectural way the subtext, meaning, connections within Dylan's work. For instance, this song was very, very well known at the time and was interpreted in a million different ways about what it meant. And I think this is Todd's example of sort of showing both that sort of like how Dylan's work sustained that kind of political analysis or critique, but also was always elusive, always fugitive, always just outside the grasp of the audience. I think it's a very intriguing idea how a narrative film where an actor, a very well-known character, is played by multiple actors who are crossing across gender. I mean, in some very remarkable way, Cate Blanchett, for me at least, in the film, really embodies Bob Dylan in this kind of uncanny and sort of spooky way. And it really, I don't know, makes me kind of consider the cult of personality and the idea of sort of the cult of celebrity around Dylan. The film was frustrating, I think, for a lot of very traditional Dylan fans who found it kind of a difficult movie because it was there were so many layers within it, and they were looking for a kind of more traditional biopic. It's a nice example, I think, of a filmmaker who's working within the idiom of a so-called biopic, but exploding it in a kind of post-structuralist way, and really getting at, in terms of the actual grammar of the film, the casting of the film, the staging of the film, at deeper issues about the fragmentation of identity.
I think it fits Dylan too, because just to do a simple narrative, would just flatten his whole life.
I think it's an interesting thing in terms of the creative part of making this film. Todd had to, I assume you realize that, again, to talk about just practical issues of copyright, to compare, for instance, film and music. Music, take a break in just a minute, music has two levels of copyright, at least generally to it. Music has the performing rights and the publishing rights. The publishing rights pertain to the person who actually wrote the music and owns the copyright of the underlying either composition of the musical score, the lyrics, and or both. And then the performing rights go to the person who actually recorded that track. So sometimes those are the same people, like, the Rolling Stones wrote a song and recorded the song. But other times, one person writes a song and another records it. In order to include any kind of music that is owned, that has publishing and performing rights in it, within a narrative film that's going to be released, you have to secure, if you're going to use a Bob Dylan track recorded by Bob Dylan, you have to get the publishing rights of Bob Dylan, and you have to get the performing rights of Bob Dylan. So in order to make this film, it was impossible to even propose making a film like this without getting Bob Dylan's consent. Bob Dylan is notoriously, as you see, an elusive, fractured character who's had many, many identities in his life, in his long lifetime. So Todd had a kind of incredibly daunting task of writing Bob Dylan this letter, like the Dear Bob Dylan letter, which he wrote, and I unfortunately didn't bring a copy of it because it was replicated. There was a New York Times Magazine article about the making of I'm Not There, in which this letter was published. And it's an extraordinarily bold letter where Todd did not approach Dylan, didn't use any of the sort of cliched ways of approaching Bob Dylan. He didn't say, you're the voice of the generation, and I want to. He avoided and eschewed all of that kind of traditional approach and talked about, I want to unravel the riddle, the mystery that is your character, and do this in a really kind of fractured way. And Dylan, much to his credit, granted complete and total rights to the music and had absolutely no contact with the film. As far as, I still don't know the answer of whether Bob Dylan ever saw I'm Not There, which I find is a funny thing. I know right after Todd made the film had been sent to Dylan, and Todd was sort of waiting with bated breath to hear back from Dylan's camp. And to my knowledge, I don't know because I haven't talked to Todd in a little while, but I don't know if he ever heard back from Dylan. But I think it's an interesting idea to think about, and this is one of the things that's fundamental and is, again, different around different mediums. This notion of intellectual property and copyright, how it functions, in particular how it functions in a movie that's going to be, is capital. Because for good, bad, right or wrong, narrative feature films within the culture we live in are capital. They are. We are working in a creative and expressive art form, but we're also we're making a commodity, and that commodity has to function, has to be served in a certain way. Sadly, the way that there's a demand for films to function as capital has escalated to such a degree, particularly in America, that the ability of filmmakers to choose what they make films about has really been diminished. I know a number of you had Adam McGoyan who talked about, making Chloe and not really wanting to make Chloe so much, having other movies he wanted to make, but feeling like this is the only movie he can get financed. I mean, that is Whether that's a cop-out or not, that is a legitimate, real thing right now. I can speak from my own experience that most of the films I'm most interested in making are not the films I'm being asked to make or being given financing. To make Savage Grace took an incredible amount of force of will, because everywhere I turn, people say, you can't make this movie. It's an impossible movie. No one wants to see the film, and we don't want to finance it. And in that instance, I just stuck it out and made the film. I think in terms of a long career, one is not always able to have that stamina. Personally speaking, I can't go through that same level of pushing a boulder up a mountain using my left shoulder alone to do that thing. So in terms of the continuity of my own career, I think one of the issues you're seeing within my work that I have a very fractured approach of making films is that in order, when I make my short experimental work, it's utterly liberating. I don't have to ask permission for anybody. I don't have to get rights for anybody. It's the pure ability to just express something cinematically. And when I'm making a narrative feature film, I realize I'm working in very different parameter and with very different rules. So it's I think that I'm lucky in a certain way to have that kind of bifurcated split within my work, where one part of my work is very kind of handmade, small-scale work, and the other is work that involves a kind of very collective, larger machine to make it happen. Before we take a break, any questions or comments or thoughts about the stuff we've looked at this first half of today? Okay, let's have our tea and coffee or whatnot.
What Goya said about the difficulty of getting pictures made now. Have you ever thought about like the horror genre as perhaps like
horror films? Horror films are kind of a stealth bomb mode of narrative representation, because you can hide within a horror film. I mean, many of the films made in the 50s that are horror films during the Hollywood blacklist are allegorical films about the Hollywood blacklist, with barely underneath the surface a kind of polemical discourse that's going on. Or if you look at the original Frankenstein, a lot of those movies really have a kind of shadow reading underneath them. Or even like in popular culture things, one of the things I found incredibly striking is to find out that the television show Bewitched was the favorite American show in the African American community during the 1960s. And there's been theoretical writing, there's been critical writing done on it, speculating that the idea of ugliness and difference that's represented in that show, that people saw in that show, because there was such a dearth of representations of any African American character, it was like, okay, well, I'll take the identification where I can find it, basically. I think it's an interesting idea that you can use kind of mainstream narrative representation to sort of encode within them certain representations. I think pretty much any genre, I think that's the benefit of genre storytelling, is that genre storytelling allows you not only to tell a story, but to make a story that is about storytelling, so that it can be read simultaneously on two levels. In other words, a horror film you can experience just being gripped by the, by your throat, by the drama of it. But you also, if you parse it and look at it very carefully, you can realize, oh, there's an allegorical equivalence under this story. And it's one of the ways you can hide within stories. If you look at all of those things from the late 50s and early 60s, there's so much about sort of conformist American ideology, and a lot of the science fiction work that's done during that period of time. They're very much films about sort of the fear of Russians, or the kind of ideological struggles that Americans were dealing with that period of time, but being done in a kind of very coded way. Okay, so now I'm going to use an example of something, again, that's purely documentary. This is very rarely seen. It's part of the more Treasures from the American Archives series that I talked about from the National Archive. It's listed on the syllabus I gave you. This collection is readily available. There's Treasures from the American Archives and more Treasures from the American Archives. There's two series. I think they've just done a third series of them. And basically it's a collection of a wide array of films made from the earliest part of the 20th century to the present. Some of them are experimental films, some of them are documentary, and many of them are films that were previously considered lost. I didn't know until the series that Zora Neale Hurston, who's best known as a fiction writer, had during the late 1920s been commissioned to make a documentary film. She had a very affluent patron on the Upper East Side of New York who financed her to go down in the South in 1928 and make the film that you see here. Unfortunately, the film was never completed. She shot about 40 minutes of footage, and so the archive put together this 7-minute section of the film. And I want to make a sort of comparison between this film and a narrative fiction film from many years later. So
was this what became of Tall My Horse? Like she wrote a
No, I mean, not that I know of, but let's read this, I'll show you the, boom, boom, boom. Probably can't read it, so I'll read it for you. It says, before writing the novels and most of the folktales for which she is now celebrated, Zora Neale Hurston traveled through the South, gathering stories and documenting traditions. She was then the sole African-American among the Columbia University graduate students of Franz Boas, the nation's leading anthropologist who arranged for her 1927 fellowship. Formalized curiosity and poking and prying with a purpose were what she called her travels. Boas recognized that her field work was not exactly dispassionate and worried that she is so much more artistic rather than scientific. For her second Southern trip in 1928, she was provided with a car, expenses, and a 16mm motion picture camera by the woman who became her benefactor through the early 1930s, Charlotte Osgood Mason. The 75-year-old Park Avenue widow was herself an amateur anthropologist whose interest in, quote, primitivism led her also to support other Harlem Renaissance artists, whatever that means. Poet Langston Hughes described her as a very old, very white-haired, but amazingly modern in her ideas, notwithstanding that his and other recipients of her funds were instructed to call her godmother. You know, take it where you can get it. Unable to gather field material herself, she essentially contracted Hurston to bring back notes in the film footage excerpted here. Known to survive are 9 short 16mm reels, together running about 30 minutes from the 15 or more that Hurston shot. The raw footage was never edited, although notes made by Mason suggested an intention to do so. Quote, could stand considerable cutting, or, quote, not clear what is being done or why, are among her harsh comments. Hurston apparently had not previously operated a movie camera, and there are the expected number of badly exposed and otherwise unusable shots. Still, as revealed in excerpts such as the 5 selected here, her images are stunningly evocative. Franz Boas's worries about Hurston's scientific eyes were no doubt justified. The footage is more than an anthropologic document of African-American life in the South, although it is that also, and reflects back on the artist behind the camera. The first excerpt from the first reel she shot was taken in January 1928 in Alabama, where Hurston had been born in 1891. She shaved 10 years off her age. I didn't know this until recently, until night school in 1917, and kept up the deception. Seen on his porch and on his woodpile is Cudjoe Lewis, born 1847, died 1935, known in most of Hurston's writings by his West African birth name, Kasula. He was thought to be the last survivor of the final slave ship to the United States, the Clotilde, on which he had survived in Mobile Bay in 1859. Hurston also located a woman with memories of an African childhood who she kept secret from Mason and did not film. The other 4 excerpts were taken in Florida later in 1928. Seen next are workers at the Everglades Cypress Lumber Company near Lauman, 30 miles south of Eatonville, the early incorporated all-black township where Hurston was raised in Central Florida. She rented a room in February at a company boarding house, ready to gather folk material, but initially, as she recounts in Mules and Men, she found the lumber workers standoffish, as is suggested by the distance that they keep from her shots. Her constant questions and possession of a car had led workers to assume that, quote, I must be a revenue officer or a detective of some kind. As a black woman traveling alone through the South, packing up packing a pistol for protection and sleeping in her car wherever she colored lodgings were unavailable, she surely stood out at the time. Along with folktales, Hurston wrote to Boas that she had gathered a collection of children's games. Much of her most engaging film footage of children, as in the 4th example. In shots not included here, the children intermittently hold up numbers on sheets of paper, apparently keyed on her written notes about their games. Titles held by kids do not show, grumbled Mason about the overexposure. After filming immersion baptisms, as in the final excerpt here, Hurston inquired of Boas, is she safe for me to say that baptism is an extension of water worship as a part of the pantheism, just as a sacrament is an extension of cannibalism? The young women outside a Florida cabin in the 3rd excerpt evoke the milieu of Hurston's greatest novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. In the casual close-ups of these women, as well as in the faces of the dancing children, it is evident that whatever Hurston's initial difficulties with the lumber workers, she soon won the trust of her subjects and recorded those who referred to as the Negro furthest down with rare intimacy. So then it has a little section about the music. So let's see, back to title screen. There we go, okay. And I think it's remarkable, really remarkable material, and it's somewhat heartbreaking that this material never got realized as a complete documentary. I think it's just incredible material that captures stuff. It functions on a kind of a number of levels for me that I think are interesting. One of the things it's strongly connected to is this notion that the urge to make this film is an anthropological urge. The idea of using film or photography as a tool to record a fugitive or changing culture. And in that way, you could see what Zora Neale Hurston is doing here is connected to the work of some photographers, actually. Two leap to mind. One is a German photographer named August Sonder, who's quite famous for trying to photograph. He photographed during the early part of the 20th century into the 20s and 30s, and basically his project was trying to photograph every single type of human that existed. So he photographed a baker, a butcher, every single kind of person. It's a remarkable body of photography of basically very simple portrait shots, usually standing head to toe, of all of these different types, and trying to look at the sort of social codes of, class differences, gender differences, race differences of these characters, and peel away the layers to try to make a kind of global portrait of people. The other person that really strongly recalls to me is an African photographer named Seydou Keita. It's Seydou, and his last name is Keita. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of his work. If you've ever seen his work, unfortunately I didn't bring in copies of that still work, but he, like August Sonder, set his project to do a kind of, what we would call an anthropological survey of all the villagers in his community, and did beautiful, incredibly moving portrait work that captured little girls, workers, all of these different types of people. I think there's something really remarkable in this material in terms of the way that it's capturing the fugitive culture of this transitional South in the post-Reconstruction, in the period in the late 20s when the legacy of slavery was still palpable among an older generation, but was also rapidly going to be gone. That first footage of the man who had been brought over on a slave ship was soon to die. He died in the mid-1930s. And this kind of idea of capturing something for historical purposes, and also to see sort of in the physiognomy of the character the truth of the life led, I think is really moving, really compelling. You can see this kind of anthropological, naturalistic approach being expressed in a number of cinematic methods as well. There's a kind of deep streak in American filmmaking, but you can also find it in European filmmaking, which is a kind of idea of lyrical naturalism. Two filmmakers I think that you could see that being connected to the tradition of lyrical naturalism would be Terrence Malick, who directed Badlands, Days of Heaven, and Thin Red Line, or director of the next generation, David Gordon Green, another Southern director who made a kind of lyrical, expressive movie that was trying to work within a natural idiom to capture a kind of very specific cultural time and place. Another example that's perhaps less known, sadly, than Terrence Malick is the remarkable filmmaker Charles Burnett, who directed a film called, his first feature was called Killer of Sheep. And I'm going to show, sort of for comparison's sake, Killer of Sheep.
Now, does Zora Neale Hurston not use sound when she recorded those?
There was she shot 16 millimeter. I assume most of you know that if you're shooting in 16 millimeter film, unlike video, splits the recording of sound and picture. So if you have a 16 millimeter camera and you'd have to have a slate operator and you'd have to have some microphone technique. During the 1920s, you would be doing it on open reel recorders. So it would have required her to have a crew beyond herself. She would have been a camera operator herself. There probably would have been a boom operator and a sound recorder. So at the minimum, there would be 3 people. Because of the mobility and working, she didn't have any stuff. So as far as I know, all that exists is the silent material. Oh God, that's very
And are there film notes that go along with this that have been preserved somewhere?
The archive that has, what I can say is I know that all the reels of this material exist. So in other words, when they archived this material in the More Treasures from the American Archives series, they just selected that 7-minute section. There's 6 times that amount of footage, or 5 times that amount of footage that exists. That footage is probably, to my knowledge, most of the material in this stuff is held by the National Archive in Washington. So when I was talking about the National Archive in Washington as a resource, it may be your best bet to track into this stuff. What I would do is try to contact the organizers of this series and see that, what are the underlying issues. I'm sure there are rights issues with the material. I'm sure the Zora Neale Hurston material is not in the public domain because she has an estate. I have no doubt about it. And so the copyright of this material is probably held by her estate, unless there was some kind of contractual arrangement with that crazy benefactor who prompted her to make the material. That, I don't know the underlying story. What I'm so struck by with this material is just the kind of lyricism and truthfulness and the kind of capturing of something that just so much of that kind of period of time. And also kind of really is deeply connected to something that's very much about a kind of deep streak of filmmaking. Again, when I was talking earlier today about this kind of difference, the kind of polarity between the notion of expressionism and naturalism in filmmaking, and this is a kind of, a really powerful, moving, I think, representation of the idea of a naturalistic approach. Let me change the aspect, so we are at 4:3. Correct. Okay. Let's see what I'm showing clockwise of this. Okay. This is Killer of Sheep. It is Charles Burnett's first feature. It was directed in 1975. It came out. It is a film set in South Central Los Angeles. It's really worth seeing if you've not seen the entire film. There have been a number of recent American independent films that have been hugely influenced by this film. This film was very difficult to access for a long time. One direct connection is that Charles Burnett was a teacher and mentor to the African-American filmmaker Julie Dash. I assume some of you might know Julie Dash's work. She directed a film called Daughters of the Dust. Julie Dash also directed a short film that I really, it's sad that it's not more known. She made a short film called Illusions before she made the film called Daughters of the Dust, which is this remarkable black and white film that tells the story of an African-American woman whose job it was to replace the vocal tracks of white actresses who can't sing. It's an incredibly beautiful film. And I have to say, among all the films that really influenced Swoon, Julie Dash's Illusion was the #1 film that broke through. Unfortunately, Illusions is very difficult to track down. To my knowledge, the only place you can get your hands on it is a place called the Video Databank. The Video Databank, if you search it on Google, you can access it. My short experimental work is also distributed at the Video Databank. 2 resources I could reference if you want a kind of deep pool of experimental video work in the United States would be the Video Databank, which I believe is vdb.org, and the other one is Electronic Arts Intermix. If you just type EAI in Google, it will bring you to the website. I'm distributed on both of those sites, as are dozens of other artists. It's a really interesting pool, and also a very easy way to access and sort of get an overview of a bunch of this traditional work. It's called EAI.
What does it stand for?
It stands for Electronic Arts Intermix.
And would UCLA have an archive? Because both Charles Burnett and Julie
UCLA for sure has Killer of Sheep archived. There's no doubt about it. I know that for sure. Julie's work, I don't know. I mean, I assume those of you are, some of you are fans of Julie or know her work. Julie's particular case. I mean, Julie's I think, to be blunt about it, Julie was white and male. She would have made 10 movies by now. The fact that she was African-American female. And Daughters of the Dust is anyone know the movie? Anyone see the film in this room? It's an incredible film that tells the story of the Gullah Island community. The Gullah Island community was an island off the coast of South Carolina where a slave ship was wrecked in the late 19th century. And a population of African slaves were brought over to America, formed an indigenous separate community. They were free slaves during the late part of the 19th century. And 1865, when the Civil War ends and slavery is declared ended, there's a kind of transition. And this movie, Daughters of the Dust, captures the moment of transition of these people who have been living in a kind of isolated island, the Gullah Sea Islands, as they move over the mainland. It's a really beautiful lyrical film. It's also kind of a very intriguing film because it was released, don't quote me, but it's released somewhere in the mid-90s, like around 94, 95. And at that period of time, the notion of what a so-called African-American audience was looking for was constituted as kind of urban black comedy. That was it. You're supposed to do a kind of urban black comedy, so nobody wanted to touch Daughters of Dust. Julie was not daunted by this prospect, and she went about doing what very few filmmakers do, which is to self-distribute the film. And much to the surprise of everybody, the film grossed more than Gus Van Sant's second feature. I mean, it did remarkably well. It grossed over $5 million in the United States, won Best Cinematography at Sundance, and it really demonstrated that the kind of notion of this kind of presumption of what constituting a monolithic black audience was just a completely naive mistake. That, of course, just like any other identity, there are many different points and perspectives within a so-called community. And that was an example of, there was a hunger and an interest in this kind of historical movie that was looking back at kind of neglected and forgotten period of time. Julie did a really beautiful job of also integrating trained actors with untrained actors. There's a young woman named Alva Rogers who plays one of the leads in the film, who I actually knew as a singer originally in New York and who does her first acting work in that film. Sadly, Julie's not made a second feature. She's somebody who I'm still waiting to see her make her second feature because the Daughters of Dust is such a remarkable film. Charles Burnett has been such a mentor to her. This film was made in '75. It was somewhat a kind of word-of-mouth legend for a long time, and there was a video distributor called Milestone in the United States that finally re-released the film. This film was basically impossible to see from 1975. I mean, not impossible, but very difficult to see between 1975 until about the year 2000, the early 2000s. And the release of this film, I think you can see the aftermath and the immediate effect of it. One film in particular I would cite is a film called Ballast, directed by a young American director named Lance Hammer, which was shot in the South, starring he's a white director, but it's a film about an African-American family in the South, and it's starring entirely non-professional actors, and the kind of lyrical naturalism that film espouses is heavily influenced by the work of Charles Burnett.
What did you think about The Sleep with Anger?
I think that was remarkable. What do you think of it as a piece of work?
I'm not really a film person. I just like it or not. I like it.
Yeah, no, I like it. I mean, I think it's a remarkable piece of work. Charles Burnett also, what's really nice about this, if you get the Milestone DVD of Killer of Sheep, there's a secondary disc that has My Brother's Wedding and a number of other short films that I had never seen before. And that's one of the, when we talk about changing models of distribution and think about the way film has changed, the notion of the theatrically released feature film as the only way to see movies. There's something sad about that paradigm being lost, but what's fantastic about the advent of DVD and other modes of distribution is it allows us to have access to movies from 20, 30, 40 years ago that have been considered forgotten, and not just for historical or archival purposes, but also you literally see the ripple effect. Earlier today I was talking about seeing I Am Cuba and the effect it directly had on Boogie Nights. Killer of Sheep directly influenced. If you see the movie Ballast, you'll know the minute you see the film how it was and why it was influenced by this film. So I'm going to show the very beginning of the movie.
Do you want the stars to play with? Want the moon to run away with? So bye-bye. When your mother's on,
You let him want to jump on your brother again, and you just stand and watch. Boy, I'll beat you to death. I don't care who started what, or whether he was winning or losing. When you get a stick or goddamn brick, get anything, you knock the shit out of whoever fighting over.
Stop there. It's a very difficult film to get a clear sense of in excerpt, I can say that. It's quite mysterious to watch the first 6 or 7 minutes of the movie because there's a quite mysterious language of character introduction because dialogue is so restrained in the beginning of the film. Visual storytelling is strongly relied upon. You really have to sort of slowly do the detective work of establishing character relationships and the rest of it. So you have a sense of the narrative. The protagonist of the film is the man you meet who is fixing the sink. And it's basically his story. He works in the slaughterhouse. He is a killer of sheep, actually. And we slowly center out from his life and his family relationships. The very beginning of the film is actually showing a flashback of when that character was a child. Killer Sheep has been strongly kind of written about and understood and framed by notions of connections to Italian neo-realist cinema. Italian neo-realist cinema was invented in the late 1940s. It's a post-war kind of creation, Rossellini being one of the key figures of it, movies like Open City and other films from the late 40s that typify the shift in narrative filmmaking from kind of stylized, expressionist techniques into a kind of documentary infused naturalistic style. I think there are definite affinities between Killer of Sheep and Italian neo-realist cinema, but I actually think it's kind of a misapprehension of the movie in a funny way. It's a misunderstanding of the movie in a way. I also think you could see this movie as purely in a kind of inspired by the anthropological instincts of recording a very specific time and place. This is capturing South Central Los Angeles in the late 1970s, post many years after the Watts riots, capturing an incredibly devastated community that was struggling to sort of find autonomy and put itself back on its feet. It's also a film that's coming directly on the heels of blaxploitation. For those of you who are not aware of blaxploitation, it's a kind of movement that begins in the early 1970s that was ostensibly supposed to be a movement by and for the African American community. And although there are a number of course, actors involved in the blaxploitation films that were African American and even writers and directors, Charles Burnett, I know for sure, saw those movies as exploitative and wanted to try to show a kind of portrait of urban living that was grained, layered, truthful, that really found things sort of in place. I think what's so interesting about his filmmaking is not just the sense of place that he captures, but also the kind of incredible lyricism that he creates in terms of the grammar of filmmaking. This, for instance, is think of the shot that you first see of the kids playing, where you just see half the screen with boards and a hand holding it. That's a brilliant example to me of the use of off-screen space. There's tension created by staying on that image for a long time, and your imagination starts thinking, what's happening? What's going on? There's a kind of very powerful kind of use of character introduction in his filmmaking, where he's using off-screen space and the notion of slow disclosure, where things come to focus very slowly, and you kind of get this kind of, in the same way you do in life, where we meet and see someone, and our first impression is from across the room, and they slowly come into focus, and as you approach them, you begin to see them. His filmmaking functions in that way. You slowly meet the characters. There's a kind of distance between them, and by the time you get into the film, it becomes quite intimate. There's a kind of lovely quality to that. I also think there's a kind of effortless quality of documentary photography that also is infused with a kind of metaphoric or allegorical quality. So, kids playing by putting their heads on a train track and trying to push the train over their head. I mean, it's both an image of kind of childhood invention and a kind of heartbreaking image of the kind of material conditions and lives that these kids were leading. And I think there's a kind of beautiful way that his filmmaking is poised between these two things. This is a film, I think, it's an example of a film that was a kind of undersung, underknown film that came out in the late 70s, but as time has accrued, it's become, I think, a really important classic, and it's a film that is both looking back and connecting to some of the traditions, both in photography and filmmaking, but particularly looking forward to where we're going. Interestingly, there's been, the New York Times last year wrote in the New York Times Magazine, published an article on the notion of neo-realist filmmaking. And talked about a number of filmmakers, including the Dardenne brothers in Europe, but there are a number of young American filmmakers. Lance Hammer's Ballast is an example of that, and another one is an Iranian-American filmmaker who's actually one of my colleagues at Columbia University, named Ramin Barani. He's made 3 films, one called Man Pushcart, the second one called Chop Shop, and the third one called Goodbye Solo.